Well, good morning, Trinity. I'd like to welcome you to a late version of Scout Sunday. Normally, we do Scout Sunday the first Sunday of the month of February, which is closest to the founding of the Boy Scouts of America, February the 8th, 1910. But this year, due to some schedule conflicts, bad weather, here we are today. We're on the last Sunday rather than the first, so better late than never. I'm going to be reading from a little book here. It's called The Butterfly Effect. My mother gave this to my son Ben on his 10th birthday. It's got some pretty good messages in here. I hope you enjoy it, but I will start off with an apology. I did this a few years ago at a Methodist men's dinner. So for all you guys that were there that night, I'm sorry. You're just going to have to sit through it again, but we'll get through it. And I've also got some visual aids here. I hope that'll help you out with our story as we go. But the book is entitled The Butterfly Effect. It was written by Andy Andrews in 2009. How significant is my life? Do I make a difference? When I move, when I act, when I do something, does the universe notice? Do I really matter? In 1963, Edward Lawrence, this fellow right here, who was a meteorologist, by the way, he presented a hypothesis to the New York Academy of Science. His theory, stated simply, was that a butterfly could flap its wings, set molecules of air in motion, and this would in turn move other molecules of air, moving more molecules of air, eventually capable of starting a hurricane on the other side of the planet. Now, Lawrence and his ideas were literally laughed out of that conference. What he had proposed was ridiculous. It was preposterous, but it was fascinating. Therefore, because of the idea's charm and intrigue, the so-called butterfly effect became a staple of science fiction, remaining for decades a combination of myth and legend spread only by comic books and bad movies. So imagine the scientific community's shock and surprise when more than 30 years after the possibility was introduced, physics professors working from colleges and universities worldwide came to the conclusion that the butterfly effect was authentic, accurate, and viable. Soon after, it was accorded the status of a law, now known as the law of sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. That's a mouthful. This principle has proven to be a force encompassing more than mere butterfly wings. Science has shown that the butterfly effect engages with the first movement of any form of matter, including people. Let me get ahead of myself. There we go. Here's our first character. So did you know that there was once existing in this country a single man who more than a century ago made one move that still dramatically affects how we live today? This fellow right here, he was a 34-year-old school teacher by the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And on a hot, humid day of July 2nd, 1863, Mr. Chamberlain found himself in the fight of his life. He's a former professor of rhetoric from Bowdoin College in Maine. He was now a colonel in the Union Army. Chamberlain stood at the far left edge of a group of 80,000 men, strung out in a line across fields and hills, stretching all the way to a little town called Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Now, earlier that day, Colonel Vincent had placed Chamberlain and his men of the 20th Maine at the end of the line, saying, "Whatever you do, you can't let them come through here." And Chamberlain couldn't withdraw, and he knew it. If the Confederate Army overran them, the rebels would gain the high ground, and the Union Army would be quickly defeated. In essence, 80,000 men would be caught from behind on a downhill charge with no protection. To win, the Confederates would have to come through Chamberlain. So at 2:30 p.m., the first charge came from the 15th and 47th Alabama regiments. They attacked uphill, running as fast as they could and firing at Chamberlain's men who were stationed behind a rock wall. they'd thrown up that very morning. The 20th Maine stopped the rebel charge and pushed them back down the slope, only to face a second and then a third charge. On the fourth assault, Chamberlain was knocked down by a bullet that hit him dead center in the belt buckle. Realizing that he wasn't seriously hurt, the colonel scrambled to his feet, continuing to fight. Again, they halted the enemy's charge, and again the rebels retreated down the hill. Now, at that time in history, battles were fought with artillery and small arms ammunition. The struggles were close, face-to-face affairs. With their fourth charge, the Confederates almost made it to the wall, which was a thigh-high stack of flat rocks that ran about 110 yards in length. As they waited for the next charge, Chamberlain felt sorry for his men. He later recalled, "Their leader had no real knowledge of warfare or tactics. I was only a stubborn man, and that was my greatest advantage in this fight. I had, deep within me, the inability to do nothing." Chamberlain continued, "I knew I may die, but I also knew that I would not die with a bullet in my back. I would not die in retreat. I am at least like the Apostle Paul, who wrote, 'This one thing I do, I press toward the mark.'" The attack came again. On this, the fifth charge, the Confederates broke open the wall and fighting raged on both sides. Without time to reload, the men were swinging their rifles at each other and brawling with fists and knives. But somehow, the 20th Maine pushed the rebels downhill another time. After that fifth broken charge, Chamberlain's younger brother Tom appeared with Sergeant Tozier, an old hard-nosed soldier. Tozier had a thick wad of torn shirt tucked into a hole stuck in his shoulder where he'd been wounded. "No help from the 83rd, the sergeant said. They're shot to ribbons, and all they can do is extend the line a bit. We're getting murdered on our flank." "Can we extend?" Chamberlain asked. "There's nothing to extend," Tom answered. "More than half of our men are down." And it was true. Chamberlain's command had started in Bangor, Maine 6 months earlier with 1,000 men. They started that morning with 300, and now they were down to 80. "How are we for ammunition?" the colonel asked. "Well, we've been shooting a lot," was his brother's answer. "I know we've been shooting a lot," he snapped. "I want to know, how are we holding out? How much ammunition do we have left?" As Tom ran to check, a 12-year-old lookout had climbed a tree, and he yelled, "They're forming up again, Colonel." Chamberlain looked up to see the boy pointing down the hill. "They're forming up right now, and they've been reinforced. Sir, there's a lot more of them this time." At that moment, a messenger stumbled into their midst. Out of breath, he said, "Sir, Colonel Chamberlain, sir. Colonel Vincent is dead." "Are you sure, soldier?" "Yes, sir," he gasped. "He was shot right at the first of the fight. They were firmed up by Weed's brigade, but now Weed's is dead. And they moved Hazlett's battery up top. Hazlett's dead too." Chamberlain's brother came running back. "Joshua," he said, "we're out. 1-2 rounds per man at the most. Some of the men don't have anything at all." Chamberlain turned to a thin man standing on his right. It was First Sergeant Ellis Spear. "Spear," he ordered, "tell the boys to take the ammunition from the wounded and the dead." "We did that last time, sir. Maybe we should think about pulling out." Chamberlain responded grimly, "We will not be pulling out, Sergeant. Carry out my orders, please." "Colonel," Sergeant Tozier spoke up, "we won't hold them this time, sir. You know we won't." "Joshua," it was his brother Tom again, "here they come." Chamberlain stepped to the top of the wall, in full view, crossing his arms and staring at the enemy. The 15th and 47th Alabama were now enforced by a Texas regiment. They moved up the hill with their high-pitched shriek, the rebel yell. It coursed up toward Chamberlain and his men. Sergeant Spear was standing at the colonel's feet. Sergeant Tozier, Chamberlain's brother Tom, and Lieutenant Melcher, the flag bearer, were huddled below. "Joshua," his brother said, "do something. Give an order." Chamberlain stood there for a moment, deep in thought, quickly sorting the situation. "We can't retreat," he thought. "We can't stay here. When I'm faced with the choice of doing nothing or doing something, I will always choose to act. He turned his back on the advancing rebels, looked down at his men, and said, "Fix bayonets." At first, no one moved. They just stared at him with their mouths open. "Fix your bayonets now," he ordered. "Execute a great right wheel of the entire regiment. Swing the left first. Do it now." Lieutenant Melcher spoke first, and he was confused. "Sir, what is a great right wheel?" But the colonel had already jumped off the wall and was moving to the next group of men. Sergeant Tozier answered the question. "He means to charge, son. A great right wheel is an all-out charge." Then turning, the colonel pointed his sword directly down the hill. Facing overwhelming odds, Chamberlain slashed his blade through the air, and with a power born of courage and fear, the school teacher from Maine roared, "Charge!" The remaining 80 fighting men lifted their voices to match that of their leader. They cried tumbling over the wall into a history about which most people in our country have never heard. For when the Confederate troops saw Chamberlain, the leader of the opposition, mount the wall, they immediately stopped, unsure as to what was happening. And when the colonel pointed his sword toward them and commanded his men to charge, they turned and ran. They threw down their loaded weapons. The rebels were certain that these were not the same soldiers they'd been facing. Surely these men had been reinforced. A beaten regiment would not charge. In less than 5 minutes, Chamberlain had his sword on the collarbone of a Confederate captain. "You, sir, are my prisoner," he stated. The man turned around a fully loaded Navy Colt revolver, and he offered it to Chamberlain. "Yes, sir," he answered, "I am." Within 5 more minutes, that ragged group of 80 men under Chamberlain's command, without any ammunition, captured over 400 soldiers of the enemy. It's an amazing story, and it's absolutely true. But here's what most people never consider. Historians have determined that had Chamberlain not charged that day, the rebels would have won at Gettysburg. Further, historians tell us, had the rebels won at Gettysburg, the South would have won the war. The war itself would have been over with by the end of that summer. Most people assume that had the South won the war, today we would exist as two countries, the Union and Confederacy. Historians, however, insist that if the South had won the war, we would now live on a territorial fragmented continent much like that of Europe. North America would be divided into 9 to 13 countries. Which means, when Hitler swept across Europe in the 1940s, had Chamberlain not charged on that afternoon so long ago, there would not have existed a United States to stand in the breach. When Hirohito systematically invaded the islands of the South Pacific, there would not have been a country big enough, strong enough, wealthy enough, and populous enough to fight and win 2 wars on 2 fronts at the same time. The United States of America exists as it does today because of a single man, one 34-year-old school teacher, and one move he made more than a century ago. So don't you see, Chamberlain is a human example of the butterfly effect. One man who made one move whose effects still ripple through your life today. You are no less an example of the butterfly effect than Chamberlain was. Everything you do matters. Every move you make, every action you take, not just to you or your family or your business or your hometown. Everything you do matters to all of us forever. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. On Friday, April 2nd, 2004, ABC News honored a man who at that time was 91 years old. The news program was running a regular segment called Person of the Week. Usually the honoree's accomplishments are listed in advance, and by the time the name's announced, most folks have already guessed who the identity of that week's recipient is. In this instance, however, their pronouncement left many viewers puzzled. And so our Person of the Week is, the anchorman finally said, Norman Borlaug. Now, you can only imagine the frowns from people. Who did he say? Borlaug who? Yet despite his unfamiliarity with us, Norman Borlaug is a man who is personally responsible for drastically and dramatically changing the world in which we live. You see, in the early 1940s, Norman Borlaug hybridized high-yield, disease-resistant corn and wheat for arid climates. So from the Dust Bowl of Western Africa to our own desert Southwest, from South and Central America to the plains of Siberia, across Europe and Asia, Borlaug's specific seed product flourished and regenerated where no seed had ever thrived before. Through the years, it's now been calculated that Norman Borlaug's work saved from famine more than 2 billion lives. Well, actually, it was never reported, but the anchorman was misinformed. It was not Norman Borlaug who saved the 2 billion people, though very few caught the mistake. It was a man named Henry Wallace. Now, Henry Wallace was the Vice President of the United States under Franklin Roosevelt. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, I thought Harry Truman was the Vice President under Roosevelt. Well, that's true. But you remember Roosevelt served 4 terms. He had 3 different vice presidents, and the second man to serve as Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 45 was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the former Secretary of Agriculture, who after his 1 term as vice president was dumped from the ticket in favor of Truman. While Wallace was vice president, however, he used the power of that office to create a station in Mexico whose sole purpose was to hybridize corn and wheat for arid climates. And he hired a young man named Norman Borlaug to run it. So Borlaug won the Nobel Prize, and Borlaug was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But considering the connection, it was really Henry Wallace that saved the 2 billion people, right? Or was it this fellow, George Washington Carver? You remember Carver, don't you, the Peanut Man? Here's something that very few people know about him. When Carver was 19 years old and a student at Iowa State University, he had a dairy sciences professor who on Saturdays and Sundays would allow his 6-year-old boy to go on botanical expeditions with the brilliant student. It was George Washington Carver who took that boy and instilled in him a love for plants and a vision for what they could do for humanity. It was George Washington Carver who pointed 6-year-old Henry Wallace's life in a specific direction, long before he ever became Vice President of the United States. Now, it's amazing to contemplate that George Washington Carver, flapping his wings with the butterfly, he developed 266 things from the peanut that we still use today. He flapped his wings with the sweet potato, and by the way, there's 88 things that Carver originated from the sweet potato that we still use today. And while no one else was looking, Carver flapped his wings a couple of times with the 6-year-old boy and just happened to save the lives of more than 2 billion people and counting. So maybe it should have been Carver as that person of the week on ABC News. Or was it the farmer from Diamond, Missouri? Moses and his wife Susan lived in a slave state, but they didn't believe in slavery. That was a problem for psychopaths like Quantrill's raiders. They terrorized the area by destroying property, burning and killing. And sure enough, one cold January night, Quantrill's raiders rode through Moses and Susan's farm. The outlaws burned the barn, shot several people, and dragged off a woman named Mary Washington. And she refused to let go of her infant son, George. Mary Washington was Susan's best friend, and with his wife distraught, Moses quickly sent word out through the community, and 2 days later, he managed to secure a meeting with the bandits. On a black horse, Moses rode several hours north to a crossroads in Kansas. And there at the appointed time, in the middle of the night, he met 4 of Quantrill's raiders. They were on horseback, carrying torches and flour sacks tied over their heads with holes cut out for their eyes. And there Moses traded the only horse he had left for what they threw at him in a dirty burlap bag. As they thundered off on their horses, Moses fell to his knees, and there alone on that dark winter night, the farmer pulled from the bag a cold, naked, almost dead baby boy. Quickly he jerked open his coat and his shirt, and he placed the child next to his skin. Covering him then with his own clothes and relying on the warmth of his own body, the man turned and walked that baby out. Moses walked through the night and into the next morning to get that child to safety. He sang to the child and told him he would care for him. He promised the boy he would educate him to honor his mother, whom they knew was already dead. That was the night that the farmer gave that baby his name. And that's how Moses and Susan Carver came to raise that baby, George Washington. We know as George Washington Carver. So when you think about it, maybe it was that farmer from Diamond, Missouri who saved those 2 billion people. Unless, is there really an ending to this story? Not exactly. So exactly who was it that saved these 2 billion people? Is there a specific person to whom we could point? How far back would we have to go? How many lives would we need to examine in order to determine who it was that really saved those 2 billion people? A number that continues to increase every minute. And how far forward would we need to go in your life to show that you make a difference? I'm going to deviate from reading here for just a second. This applies to everybody assembled here today. But guys, scouts, hang on to these few words I'm going to read here. And I hope you grasp what we're trying to tell you. You see, there's generations yet unborn whose very lives are going to be shifted and shaped by the moves you make and the actions that you take today and tomorrow and the next day and the next. Every single thing you do matters. You've been created by God as one of a kind. On the planet Earth, there's never been one like you, and there never will be again. Your spirit, your thoughts, your feelings, your ability to reason and to act all exist in no one else. The rarities that make you special are no mere accident or quirk of fate. You've been created in order that you might make a difference. You have within you the power to change the world. And know that your actions, they can't be hoarded or saved for later or used selectively. By your hand, millions, billions of lives will be altered, caught up in a chain of events begun by you this day. The very beating of your heart has meaning and purpose. Your actions have value far greater than silver or gold. Your life and what you do with it today matters forever. We're going to be closing the service today with a bit of ceremony.